Viking women. Fighters? The truth revealed.
Okay, let's unpack something that's become, well, just a really powerful symbol in our modern imagination. The Viking Shield-Maiden. You see her everywhere, don't you? Striking poses in video games, commanding respect in those epic TV series like Vikings. She's this fierce, independent warrior, kind of embodying female strength and defiance from, a bygone era. She's definitely captivating.
She really is.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
image, it resonates so deeply with people today. It represents agency, power, challenging traditional boundaries, all set against that dramatic Viking Age backdrop. It's no wonder she's become so ingrained in pop culture.
Right. But look, this is the deep dive, and our mission is always to go beyond just the popular image. So today we're tackling the core question. Is this Shield-Maiden figure actually rooted in historical reality? Or is she, primarily a product of myth, folklore, and maybe modern storytelling?
That's the crux of it.
We're going to try and separate the fact from the legend. We'll be digging into the actual available sources, the literary accounts that kind of started the whole legend, and crucially, the archaeological evidence that's forcing a major rethink.
And that's a key point because for a long time, the historical consensus, it leaned really heavily towards myth. Many scholars just view the Shield-Maiden as, well, a literary invention mainly, a poetic figure. But recent discoveries, particularly with the application of new scientific techniques in archaeology, they're genuinely challenging that long-held view. It's demanding a pretty significant reevaluation.
Which means we're probably not looking for just a simple yes or no answer here.
No, definitely not.
It sounds like we're looking at something much more nuanced and I think maybe ultimately more fascinating. So where do we start? Let's begin where the legend itself seems to have started with those whispers from the past, specifically the literary evidence we find in the sagas.
Precisely. Yeah, when we talk about literary evidence for female warriors, the primary sources we inevitably turn to are the Norse sagas. Now, these are epic prose narratives written down centuries after the main Viking Age, mostly in Iceland during the 13th and 14th centuries.
Okay, so hang on. They weren't written during the age of the longships and the raids themselves. That's a pretty critical point, isn't it? They're looking back in time.
Absolutely crucial, yes. They were composed several hundred years after the events they're often describing, which means they're not contemporary historical records like, say, you might get with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or Frankish Annals.
Right.
They blend historical memory, sometimes drawing on genuine oral traditions.
Right.
Yeah, but they mix it with mythological elements, heroic ideals, and, the literary conventions that were popular among those medieval Icelandic authors.
So we definitely shouldn't treat them like, history textbooks or news reports from the 9th century. They're complex stories with different layers.
Yeah.
But these sagas do feature women warriors quite prominently, don't they? I mean, this is where those really vivid descriptions come from.
They absolutely do. Yeah, the sagas are rich with accounts of women who step outside the expected gender roles to become, well, formidable fighters, advisors, even leaders in battle sometimes. They really provide those foundational narratives that have fueled the Shield-Maiden image for centuries. You find figures who explicitly reject the expected female life to pursue a martial path.
Okay, so give us some specific examples that our source material highlights. Who are these legendary figures we read about?
Well, a classic and really compelling example is Hervor. She's featured in the Hervorar saga, Oke Hærrikskonungs, the saga of Hervor and King Heidrek. Hervor is a figure who, right from childhood, is just not interested in traditionally female things like embroidery.
Okay.
Instead, she trains with weapons, becomes highly skilled, and eventually even takes on a man's identity to live as a warrior, going on expeditions. One of the most famous bits involves her confronting her father's burial mound, his barrow, to get this cursed ancestral sword, Turfing. Yeah. She's shown commanding respect from male warriors, demanding her inheritance, all in a world dominated by men.
That story sounds incredibly powerful. Defying norms, retrieving a magic sword from a grave. I mean, it clearly positions her as a central, active figure in that martial world.
It really does. Then you have figures who kind of blur the line between the heroic human and the supernatural, like Brynhildr in the Volsunga saga.
Ah, Brynhildr.
Yeah. While she's often interpreted as a Valkyrie, one of those powerful female supernatural beings linked to Odin, choosing heroes for Valhalla, Brynhildr is presented with real human-like depth and agency. Her story is tied directly to major heroes like Sigurður, and she shows immense strength of will. She's central to all these dramatic events tied to destiny and conflict. And the Valkyries themselves, of course, are the ultimate female figures connected to war and battle in Norse mythology.
Okay, so we have these overtly human warriors like Hervor, and then supernatural or sort of semi-divine figures like Brynhildr and the Valkyries, all tied into the world of war. What about someone who might be a bit more familiar from, say, modern TV shows?
Ah, that would probably be Lagertha. Now, she appears in the Gesta Danorum, which is a history of the Danes written by Saxo Grammaticus in the early 13th century. It's a slightly different context from the main Icelandic sagas, but still a crucial medieval source that informed later perceptions.
Okay.
Saxo describes Lagertha as a skilled Amazon, actually calls her a skuldmur, a shield maiden. He says she fought bravely alongside men to defend her country, even leading her own force of female warriors, playing a key role in battles, showing exceptional courage and skill with weapons. Her portrayal really cemented that archetype of the female warrior leader in later Scandinavian history.
So across these different texts, then, we're seeing these really vivid descriptions of women leading armies, fighting in battles, having martial skills apparently equal to men. These aren't just like fleeting mentions. They sound like detailed portrayals of active, powerful figures in the stories.
That's right. The sagas in these related texts, they don't shy away from depicting their prowess with weapons. Their strategic thinking, sometimes implied through things like game pieces found in burials, which we can maybe touch on later, and their direct engagement in combat. This is really where the Shield Maiden idea gets its narrative substance, its drama.
But you mentioned earlier the challenge of interpreting these sagas. Given they were written centuries later and they mix history with myth, how do we figure out how much of this is literal history and how much is, well, literary creation?
And that is the fundamental difficulty. It's the point that led so many historians to be, frankly, skeptical for a long time. Because the sagas served multiple purposes. Yeah, entertainment, but also exploring heroic ideals, preserving cultural memory, sometimes even political commentary.
Right.
It makes it incredibly challenging to pin down where the historical core ends, and maybe the poetic embellishment or allegory or just purely fictional elements begin. Are these women actual historical individuals who fought? Or are they literary symbols, embodying concepts like courage or defiance or destiny? The sagas are fantastic literature, but they just don't function as factual historical reports in the way we'd expect today.
So while the sagas definitely provide the rich narrative foundation for the Shield Maiden legend, and they certainly suggest that the idea of female warriors existed within Viking cultural consciousness, whether that was as an ideal or maybe a rare exception, or just a figure of myth, they don't give us concrete, undisputed proof of their widespread historical reality.
Exactly. They give us the concept, the powerful image, and these anecdotal accounts within narratives that are part history, part legend. And for a long time, the lack of clear corresponding evidence from other sources, well, it just reinforced the view that the saga figures were primarily literary creations, maybe based on very rare exceptions, or perhaps just representing an ideal rather than a common reality.
And that's where archaeology comes in, right? Providing a different kind of evidence, physical, tangible clues from the past. But for decades, the archaeological records seemed to actually support that skeptical view, didn't it?
It did, yeah. For a long time, archaeologists found burials that were clearly associated with warfare, containing swords, axes, shields, spears, and these were just overwhelmingly assumed to belong to men.
Naturally.
This interpretation fit very neatly with traditional understandings of gender roles in past societies, and it seemed to contradict those saga depictions of women warriors. So the archaeological silence on female warriors was seen as pretty powerful counter-evidence to the literary accounts.
So archaeology seemed to be saying, yeah, Shield Maidens, nice story, but probably just a story. But then there was a moment that completely changed the conversation.
Yes, a pivotal, really groundbreaking moment that happened relatively recently. This was the reevaluation of a specific, very well-known Viking Age grave, the warrior grave from Birka in Sweden. It's officially cataloged as BJ581.
Birka. That was a really important site, wasn't it? A major Viking Age trading town, a key hub.
Absolutely. Birka, on Birka Island in Lake Mälaren, was one of the most significant trading centers of the Viking Age in Scandinavia. And grave BJ581, it was originally excavated way back in the 1870s by an archaeologist named Hjalmar Stolpe. It was recognized immediately as a very high-status burial. Clearly belonged to someone important.
And what exactly was found in this grave? What made it stand out so much?
The grave goods were exceptionally rich, and they consistently pointed towards a military leader. The burial contained a complete set of weaponry: a sword, an axe, a spear, arrows, a shield both, that metal centerpiece of the shield.
Wow, the full kit.
The full kit. But beyond just the tools of war, it also included items suggesting strategic authority and wealth. There were game pieces and a board for Nifatafel. That's a strategic board game often associated with military tactics and leadership. And perhaps most strikingly, 2 horses buried alongside the individual.
2 horses?
2 horses. One saddle-trained and one bridle-trained, suggesting capability and readiness for both warfare and travel.
So a full warrior kit, symbols of strategic thinking, horses. I mean, everything about this burial just screamed high-status military commander.
It absolutely did. And based on the prevailing assumptions of the time about Viking society, about gender roles, about previous archaeological finds, the conclusion seemed obvious. It was unquestioned for over a century. This had to be the burial of a high-ranking male Viking warrior. It became a textbook example of exactly that kind of grave.
And that's how it was interpreted for, what, over 140 years? Until 2017? What happened then?
Well, in 2017, a team of researchers led by archaeologist Charlotte Hayden Stjana Johnson decided to apply modern scientific techniques to the skeletal remains from BG581. They did an osteological analysis looking at the bones, but most importantly, they conducted a DNA analysis of the bone material.
And the DNA analysis revealed?
The results were, well, they were absolutely stunning and critically unequivocal. The DNA analysis showed, without any question, that the individual buried in this archetypal high-status Viking warrior grave, surrounded by all the symbols of military leadership, was biologically female.
Wait, female?
Female. The mitochondrial DNA confirmed female sex, and then the X and Y chromosome analysis further backed this up, showing XX chromosomes.
Unequivocally female. Wow, I mean, that must have felt like the ground just shifting under the feet of historians and archaeologists.
It truly was a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
It was direct scientific evidence from a highly significant archaeological context that strongly indicated the existence of a high-status Viking female warrior.
Yeah.
This wasn't some debated passage in a semi-mythical saga. This was a biological individual in the ground, buried with the very tools and symbols of warfare and command. It provided a concrete physical anchor for the possibility of women in such roles.
Okay, so the Birka grave is incredibly powerful evidence. It's a single data point, sure, but a very, very strong one. Let's be really clear, though. What does this discovery definitively prove? And just as importantly, what doesn't it prove?
That distinction is absolutely vital for responsible historical interpretation. The Birka BJ My 581 discovery absolutely does not prove that all, or even, a large percentage of Viking women were warriors. It doesn't suddenly validate the idea of widespread Shield-Maiden armies roaming the land, like some popular depictions might have you believe.
Right.
One individual, even a very high-status one, doesn't represent the entire female population of the Viking Age.
Right. It's not proof that every Viking woman was capable of fighting or expected to fight.
Exactly. However, what it does strongly suggest, based on those grave goods, the military equipment, the status items, the strategic role implications, is that some women could and did hold high military status and fought as warriors. It provides compelling evidence that it was possible within Viking society for a woman to attain such a position and be buried with the full honors of a warrior. It really challenges that previous assumption that military leadership and warfare were exclusively male domains.
And perhaps its most significant impact is that it just fundamentally overturns that prior conventional wisdom that female warriors were purely mythical figures confined to folklore. The physical evidence is now undeniable for at least one very prominent case.
Yes, exactly. It moves the Shield-Maiden concept from the realm of, let's say, potential myth into the realm of historical reality, at least as a documented possibility for some exceptional individuals. It forces us to reconsider our assumptions about gender roles in Viking society and acknowledge that they might have been far more flexible, more complex than we previously interpreted.
So the Birka grave is this remarkable discovery. Did it then cause archaeologists to maybe look differently at other findings, things that might have been sitting in museum collections, perhaps previously misinterpreted?
It absolutely did, yeah. The Birka discovery was a catalyst. It prompted a necessary re-examination of other archaeological findings. It made scholars start asking, have we overlooked other potential evidence of female warriors because we were interpreting everything through this lens of assumed male-only military roles?
Were there other instances where weapons were found in graves that had been identified as female, but maybe they weren't given much weight before this?
Yes, there have always been some instances here and there of weapons found in graves identified as female, either based on skeletal remains or associated typically female grave goods like jewelry or brooches. However, the interpretation of these has always been debated. A key question always remains, were these weapons functional tools of war? Or could they be symbolic? Maybe symbols of status or heirlooms, or perhaps just tools for defense, or even daily tasks that happen to be buried with someone.
Okay, so finding like a knife or even a small axe in a woman's grave doesn't automatically mean she was a warrior like the Birka individual with the full kit, the game pieces, the horses.
Precisely. The context matters hugely. A single tool could be for entirely different purposes. But re-examining some graves with a more open mind is definitely important now. The real significance of the Birka grave lies in the entire assemblage of grave goods, everything together unequivocally pointing to military status and leadership, combined with that scientific confirmation of female sex. Other graves with just single or limited weapons, they require much more careful, nuanced interpretation.
What about other types of archaeological evidence, maybe beyond grave? Anything else?
Well, we also have some artistic evidence, things like small figurines or maybe amulets that depict armed women. These little pieces of Viking Age art, they offer clues into the cultural imagination, into perceptions. Now, they aren't direct proof of historical women fighting, obviously, but their existence suggests that the idea or the image of armed women was present in Viking visual culture. This could reflect mythological figures, maybe rare historical individuals, or perhaps just a cultural recognition of women's potential role in defense or combat.
So the art kind of supports the concept of female warriors, even if it doesn't prove how common they were. It shows it was an image that resonated, or at least was understood culturally.
It does. It's another piece of the puzzle, suggesting that the Shield-Maiden wasn't a totally alien concept in Viking society, even if its historical reality was perhaps limited. However, this evidence, like the grave goods, still needs careful interpretation.
And that brings us back to that ongoing scholarly debate you mentioned earlier. What are the main points of disagreement now, or the difficult questions scholars are grappling with?
Well, the questions have shifted quite significantly since the Birka discovery. As we discussed, the question is largely no longer, did any Viking women fight? Birka provided pretty strong evidence for that. The questions now are more like, how common was it? Was it an extremely rare phenomenon, maybe limited to the aristocracy or specific circumstances?
Or was it something ordinary women might do for defense, perhaps? Or was it primarily a role of leadership, like Birka suggests?
Exactly. Was it a recognized social role, or just something that happened occasionally out of necessity? And the interpretation of graves, it remains complex. Were weapons symbolic in some female burials, maybe indicating a family's martial status or an ancestral connection to warfare rather than the individual's own fighting role? How do we differentiate a burial that reflects a woman who is a warrior from one that reflects a woman of high status who is simply buried with valuable metal objects, some of which might have served multiple purposes or maybe were heirlooms? These are the difficult lines archaeologists are trying to draw now.
It sounds like it's less about if it happened and much more about how often, in what contexts, and maybe what it meant for women's status in that society.
Precisely. The debate has become much more nuanced. It's moved from, outright dismissal to trying to understand the scope and the significance of female participation in warfare within the broader context of Viking society.
And to understand that broader context, we really need to look at the full picture of Viking women's lives, beyond just the possibility of warfare. The National Museum of Denmark source you mentioned provides some great detail on this. What were the vast majority of Viking women actually doing day to day?
Right. For the vast majority, their primary role was undoubtedly that of the housewife, the husfreyja. And this was a demanding and incredibly important position within Viking society, especially in that rural agricultural economy. The source notes they managed the household and the farm with a firm hand.
Firm hand? That sounds like they weren't just, passive figures running a kitchen.
Right. Far, far from it. The housewife was the central administrator, the decision maker for the farm, especially when the men were away on those long expeditions for trade, raiding, warfare. The source explicitly states that from the moment a ship sailed, it was the woman's responsibility to ensure the farm's survival.
Wow.
Which meant securing the harvest, managing resources, overseeing labor, making crucial decisions for the whole economic unit. This required significant organizational skill, authority, and, frankly, resilience.
That's a huge economic responsibility. I mean, the survival of the family literally depended on her management skills.
Absolutely. And their daily work was extensive. Besides preparing food and general housekeeping, a massive amount of labor was dedicated to textile production, working with wool, spinning yarn, weaving cloth for clothing, blankets, tapestries, even ship sails. That was a constant, time-consuming task, vital to the household's needs, and maybe even for trade.
Textile production sounds like it was almost an industry happening right there within the home.
It really was a foundational part of their economy, and the techniques were often complex, which suggests specialized skills. They also, of course, were primarily responsible for childcare and caring for the elderly. Now, the source notes that probably all members of the household helped with daily tasks when possible, but the overall management and the heaviest load of domestic and textile labor, that fell to the women.
So, vital economic managers and producers within the home. What about outside the home? Were there other economic roles for women?
Yes, particularly in the emerging towns. Archaeological evidence from places like Birka and Hedeby indicates that women were active in trade and craftsmanship. They seem particularly associated with textile production. Evidence suggests women were specialized weavers, producing goods perhaps for sale in the market. Other evidence hints at women being involved in selling dairy products or maybe other goods. They could function as independent entrepreneurs, contributing to or maybe entirely supporting their families through trade.
So they were not confined solely to the farm. They could be active in the marketplace too. Now, the source mentions equal opportunities compared to elsewhere, but also limits. How much legal freedom did they actually have?
This is one of the most interesting aspects, I think, where Viking society really stands out compared to many contemporaries in Europe. While officially, yes, they were subordinate to men, Viking women did possess some surprising freedoms and legal rights. These are documented in written sources like the Icelandic law codes and the Sagas. They're often portrayed as independent individuals with agency. For example, while family influence was no doubt strong, a woman could, theoretically at least, choose her own husband.
Okay, some say in whom they married. What about getting out of a marriage? Was divorce possible?
Yes, and this is a key point highlighted by the sources. Scandinavia was remarkably pioneering in recognizing a woman's right to divorce her husband. We even have observations from outsiders, like that Spanish-Arabic traveler Al-Tartushi, who visited Hedeby in the 900s. He expressed surprise at the degree of independence and rights women had there, including the ability to initiate a divorce.
An outsider being surprised by their rights. That tells you a lot about how relatively advanced they might have been in this regard, doesn't it?
It really does, yeah. The Icelandic sagas detail quite specific and potentially quite advanced grounds for divorce that were available to women. For instance, a wife could demand a divorce if her husband settled abroad and didn't visit her conjugally for 3 consecutive years.
Yeah.
The stated reason in the law was actually to protect her from loneliness and neglect.
To protect her from loneliness. That's a remarkably considerate legal clause for that time period.
It is, isn't it? Other grounds included things like extreme poverty in the husband's household, or famously, if the husband struck his wife 3 times. This gave women concrete legal recourse against physical abuse and neglect.
So women had the legal right to leave a marriage based on specific criteria. That's significant agency. What happened with the kids if there was a divorce?
Generally, infants and very young children stayed with the mother. Older children were typically divided based on the relative wealth and status of the parents' families.
These rights, like the right to divorce and maybe some capacity to inherit, though you said inheritance from men was limited, maybe they could inherit from female relatives. It suggests a judicial status for women that was far more independent than we often assume for that era.
It absolutely points to that. They weren't simply property. They had legal standing to make really life-altering decisions like ending a marriage.
But you mentioned limits to this equality. It wasn't all roses.
No, exactly. It's crucial to remember it wasn't full equality by our modern standards. Officially, they were still considered inferior to men. Women couldn't appear in court themselves. They had to be represented by a male relative. Political power was firmly in the hands of men. And there was a clear double standard regarding sexual fidelity. Female infidelity was treated very seriously, could have severe consequences, while men could have mistresses. Though the main wife did retain authority and precedence within the household over other women.
Okay, so independent and with important rights, yes, but not equal in legal or political power. Still, it sounds like a much stronger position than many women had in other contemporary European societies.
Significantly stronger, yeah. This broader picture of capable, independent, and legally empowered women is really crucial context. When we think about power in Viking society, it wasn't just martial power or political power. Women could achieve significant reputation, wealth, and influence through other means too. The Oseberg burial is a prime example of this.
Ah, the Oseberg burial, that famous, incredibly rich ship burial discovered in Norway, that one.
Exactly. It's one of the most spectacular Viking Age finds anywhere. It contained 2 women, but primarily one high-status noblewoman, possibly a queen or maybe a powerful religious leader. She was buried in this elaborate ship with an astonishing array of grave goods, intricately carved wooden carts and sledges, beautiful textiles, beds, chests, and a vast collection of everyday household items, cooking pots, pans, knives, textile tools.
So a woman of immense wealth and status, buried with luxury goods, but also with the tools of the household.
It powerfully illustrates that even at the highest levels of Viking society, a woman's connection to the domestic sphere, her management of the household economy, was intertwined with her status and reputation. The Olsberg woman clearly achieved great prominence, and her grave goods reflect both her wealth and her fundamental role tied to the home.
What about other forms of power beyond household or the economy? You mentioned Ceres's earlier.
Yes, the Volvas, or seeresses. They held a unique and really powerful position in pre-Christian Viking society. They were highly respected, sometimes feared, figures who practiced magic, seer, and foretold the future. They were consulted on crucial matters, not just by individuals or families worried about their harvests or personal fates, but even by kings and army commanders before battles.
So they could potentially influence military decisions through their spiritual authority?
Potentially, yes. Their prophecies, their counsel, could sway strategies or affect morale. They held significant spiritual and social power, operating in a realm that was inaccessible to most others. And the sagas also give us examples of just really strong-willed wives whose energy and determination could effectively run things, whose influence could even overshadow their husbands in practice. Though this was apparently a delicate balance for the man's reputation. But the woman's reputation for capability often remained high.
It really seems like Viking society had multiple avenues for women to gain influence and power. Not just limited to the traditional female roles, but extending into economic, legal, and spiritual spheres as well.
Precisely. They weren't living in a society where women were completely marginalized or powerless. They had recognized roles, rights, and avenues for influence, even if formal political and military power was primarily male.
Let's circle back to a specific archaeological detail we mentioned briefly. Our source analyzes it in a really interesting way, challenging a long-held assumption, this idea of the housewife as a key carrier.
Ah, yes. This is a great case study in how new analysis can sometimes overturn established interpretations. The traditional view, based on some literary mentions and maybe early archaeological finds, was that wealthy married women in Viking society universally carried keys. It was seen as a symbol of their authority as the mistress of the household, holding the keys to the storehouses, the chests.
It's a very intuitive image, isn't it? The keeper of the keys, in charge of the home's wealth and resources.
It is. And medieval law codes in Scandinavia do mention the housewife having rights to the keys. However, the source we looked at highlights that a comprehensive re-examination of the archaeological evidence actually presents a rather different picture.
Okay, so what does the broader archaeological record of female graves actually show about keys?
It reveals that keys found as grave goods in female burials are actually quite rare. They appear in only about 5% of investigated women's graves, which is not a lot.
Only 5%? Wow.
Yeah. Furthermore, when they are found, they aren't exclusively limited to the graves of the wealthiest women. They appear in various types of burials, spanning different social strata. And perhaps most significantly, some of the keys found in graves are actually unusable. They're broken or incomplete, or they lack the mechanism to actually open a lock.
Unusable keys. And not just in the richest graves. That definitely complicates the simple interpretation of a key as solely a symbol of the wealthy housewife's authority over her stores.
It strongly suggests that while keys could certainly symbolize household authority in some contexts, their presence in graves might represent something more varied, or perhaps more symbolic. If they were purely a mark of the wealthy housewife, you'd expect them to be common in rich graves and always functional, right? The evidence just doesn't support that simple view.
So, if a key in a grave isn't necessarily just about being the mistress of the house, what other meanings might it have held? What are the alternatives?
Well, the source proposes some alternative interpretations based on symbolic potential. A key fundamentally opens and closes things. It provides access. So this could symbolize access from one stage of life to another, like the transition from childhood to adulthood, marking a change in status or responsibility.
Yeah, like a rite of passage symbol?
Possibly. Or, given the importance of women in spiritual roles, particularly the vulvas, a key could also symbolize access to hidden knowledge, to spiritual realms, or maybe the ability to perform certain rituals, like unlocking secrets, foretelling the future.
That's a much richer, more symbolic interpretation, isn't it? Representing a knowledgeable woman or someone with special access or power rather than just the manager of the pantry.
It pushes us to consider that the material culture associated with Viking women, even seemingly straightforward objects like keys, might have layers of meaning that go beyond purely domestic functions, especially when the archaeological patterns don't neatly fit the simplest literary interpretation. It kind of reinforces this idea that Viking women's roles and identities were really quite multifaceted.
Okay, so we've explored the literary origins of the Shield-Maiden legend. We've looked at that incredible archaeological revelation of the Birka grave, other supporting archaeological clues, and now this really detailed picture of Viking women's lives as vital managers, entrepreneurs, individuals with significant legal rights, holders of spiritual power. Let's try and bring all these threads together now. How does the possibility of a woman also being a warrior fit into this broader, quite complex picture?
This is where the synthesis is really key, I think. That broader context is essential. Viking women were not living in a society where they were powerless or confined or lacked capability. We've seen they were running complex farms as economic units, engaging in trade, capable of initiating divorce and having legal standing, and holding significant spiritual authority that could influence major societal decisions. They were, in many ways, already independent, capable, and influential figures in various spheres.
Right, and managing a farm while the men were away, that required strategic thinking, command, authority skills that aren't entirely unrelated to leadership in other contexts, surely.
Exactly. Running a large Viking Age farm involved significant logistical and managerial skills, oversight of labor, decision-making under pressure. So in that context, the possibility of a woman taking up arms, whether it's for the defense of that farm, maybe out of necessity during conflict, or even, as Birka suggests, in a recognized leadership role, is perhaps less of an unimaginable leap than it might seem if we viewed Viking women through a more restrictive, maybe Victorian-era lens.
It makes the idea of a woman being a warrior seem less like an absolute anomaly against a backdrop of complete domestic confinement, and more like a potential, albeit perhaps rare, extension of existing capabilities, responsibilities, and avenues for power that women already possessed in Viking society. Does that sound right?
Precisely, yes. The evidence from the sagas that gave us the initial concept to the compelling and, frankly, undeniable archaeological data like the Birka grave, it points towards the existence of female warriors in the Viking Age. While they were almost certainly not as common as depicted in later literary works or, modern fantasy, the evidence shows it happened.
And these women who might have fought, they weren't anomalies just existing in a vacuum. They were part of a society that, as we've seen, already afforded women significant, albeit still limited compared to men rights, responsibilities, and forms of power and influence, economic, legal, spiritual, and within the household.
Their potential presence on the battlefield or in positions of military command, it's just another facet of the rich and complex tapestry of Viking women's lives. It fits into a picture where women were already far more capable, independent, and influential than they are often stereotyped as being.
So as we wrap up this deep dive then, let's just recap the journey. We began with that compelling popular image of the Viking Shield-Maiden, wondering, was she fact or fiction? We explored the Norse sagas, found the origin of the legend, those vivid portrayals of female warriors, while acknowledging the interpretive challenges of literary sources. Then we turned to the hard science of archaeology, focusing on that revolutionary reevaluation of the Birka warrior grave, BJ 581, which provided the first undeniable scientific evidence for the historical existence of at least one high-status female warrior.
And we broadened our perspective significantly by examining that full picture of Viking women's lives, drawing on archaeological finds and historical texts, to understand their vital roles as managers, as entrepreneurs, as individuals with surprising legal rights, including divorce, and as wielders of spiritual power.
And the core finding, when we synthesize all this evidence, the Viking Shield-Maiden legend is not purely a myth. While not every Viking woman was a warrior, the combined literary and archaeological evidence, especially that Birka discovery, strongly supports that some women were warriors, including individuals who apparently held high military status.
And this provides us with a much richer, more complex, and I think ultimately more accurate understanding of Viking history. It really challenges those long-held assumptions about gender roles in past societies. It shows that reality, once we peel back the layers and apply rigorous analysis, can actually be just as compelling as the myths.
The Shield-Maiden endures, doesn't she? As a powerful symbol of female strength and agency. And now she's not just a figure of fantasy. She seems grounded in compelling facts, woven into the broader, complex, and deeply fascinating picture of capable, independent, and influential Viking women who navigated a society with its own unique dynamics of power and gender roles.
It adds a really vital dimension to our understanding of the past, and it reminds us how much we can learn when we actually question established interpretations.
Absolutely. And that leaves us with, well, a provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider as you finish your day. Given the evidence we've discussed today about the complex gender roles, the avenues for power and influence available to Viking women, and the documented existence of female warriors in that society, what does this specific case teach us about the dangers of assuming universal historical norms based on maybe our own modern biases? And how might applying this kind of critical, multi-source approach reveal similar hidden complexities and challenge assumptions about gender roles in other ancient cultures that we often view through perhaps too simplified a lens?
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that history is rarely as simple as our initial interpretations might suggest.
Indeed. We've taken quite a deep dive into the Shield-Maiden today, and hopefully it's given you a lot to think about.